Continuing on with our discussion about the stomach and specifically the gastric glands, we need to get into what each of the cells does and what it secretes. Basically, what's the purpose of this gastric gland? Because we only identified them last video, we need to go more into detail about what the physiology is. So first off, the parietal cells. Now, these parietal cells are going to have two main secretions that we're focusing on. The first secretion is hydrochloric acid. That's the HCl. Now, hydrochloric acid is what helps to give the stomach its very acidic environment. pH of 1.5 to 3.5 I have here. Sometimes you'll see it even down to pH of 1. But the idea is it's very acidic. Now, this acidic environment is going to help out with denaturing proteins in your food. So it's not a chemical breakdown per se. You're not using enzymes here, but instead the proteins are starting to unfold. So starting to kind of come apart. This helps with the digestion process. But it also is going to activate pepsin. Now, pepsin is originally produced as pepsinogen in inactive form. The active form of pepsin is going to help as an enzyme to break down proteins. And then you have the last one of helping to kill off bacteria. The very acidic environment is going to really destroy many of the bacteria that you ingest through your mouth there. So it really helps out to keep that environment safer for your body. The second secretion coming out of these parietal cells is your intrinsic factor. Now, the intrinsic factor is important because it helps with the absorption of vitamin B12. So it's helping you absorb vitamin B12 into your body, and this vitamin is necessary for normal functionality of your cells. But the last thing down there is saying pernicious anemia. That's where if there isn't enough intrinsic factor, or any intrinsic factor for that matter, in that case, you don't absorb enough vitamin B12, and it causes problems with red blood cell production. So intrinsic factor is important also coming from these parietal cells. So hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Then we have our chief cells. Now, these chief cells are going to help secreting pepsinogen. I mentioned that the last one because the hydrochloric acid helped to activate pepsinogen. So these chief cells work in conjunction with the parietal cells we just talked about. The chief cells produce pepsinogen. It's an inactive enzyme. The other cells, the parietal cells, then are going to secrete hydrochloric acid, which will activate the pepsinogen into pepsin. Now, once you have pepsin, it can self-activate as well. But that's needed for the enzymatic breakdown of your proteins. So chief cells, kind of important here. So it's all about hydrochloric acid and pepsin activating pepsinogen. But you have to have the hydrochloric acid first because you can't have pepsin self-activating if you never had any activated in the first place. So this is a positive feedback mechanism. Basically, the more pepsin you have, the more pepsinogen gets activated. But this is still controlled by the receptors in the stomach. You're not just simply constantly secreting this when it's not necessary. So your body monitors how much is necessary and then secretes the appropriate amounts for what is present. So again, just looking at what we have here, this is a gastric gland. You'll notice the parietal cells. There are two of them here. That's just symbolic. It doesn't mean there's only two per gland. There can be more than that. But it's just showing in this diagram there's two. You have a whole bunch of chief cells on each side. Again, this isn't exactly the way it lays out, but gives you an idea there are more chief cells. So you have that pepsinogen coming from the chief cell. You have the hydrochloric acid coming from the parietal cell. Together, that makes the active enzyme pepsin. But notice, there's one other cell down here, the enteroendocrine cell. And yes, there's two shown here, but again, that's just representation of it. It's not meaning that every gland has two of these cells. So we need to look into that enteroendocrine cell a little bit. Now these enteroendocrine cells, they're going to be secreting chemical messengers. Now the chemical messengers come in two different varieties here. First off, we're going to have these paracrine cells, or these paracrine messengers, I should say. The paracrine messengers, serotonin and histamine, they're going to act in a localized environment. That means they're not going into the blood necessarily. They're simply acting on cells close to the actual enteroendocrine cell that produced it. So the paracrine aspect is close by. But the second aspect here are hormones. You're going to have gastrin and somatostatin being produced. They will go into the bloodstream, and because in the hormones you can't pick and choose where you travel in the blood, they're going to go head to foot. But their purpose here in the bloodstream is to stimulate and help to control other aspects in the actual GI tract. So they're going to help to have more control mechanism, not just in the stomach, but help to aid in other areas as well. So paracrine, localized control and secretion. Hormones going all throughout the entire bloodstream here. So both of these type of chemical messengers are coming from the enteroendocrine cells. Now, we mentioned briefly about this mucosal barrier before, how it helps to protect the actual underlying epithelial tissue. So you have this nice bicarbonate-rich mucus. Now remember, bicarbonate helps to buffer and prevent that hydrochloric acid from hitting the simple columnar cells underneath it. But then you also have another feature here that is helping. You have tight junctions between the epithelial cells. Remember back to AP1, we mentioned tight junctions, talking about the cells and the histology. They're making sure the cells are very close together, preventing things from going between the cells. So it's forcing whatever's being absorbed to go through the cell membrane, not squeeze between. And this way, any of that hydrochloric acid doesn't just squeeze through. Yes, it can potentially damage the cells, but any damaged cells are very quickly replaced so you don't have a hole in the lining. Because if there was a hole or an opening from damaged cells, that hydrochloric acid could go all the way through the mucosal layer and start to really cause some damage. So a few different imbalances to look at here. We'll start with gastritis. Gastritis is a generalized inflammation caused by anything that does breach that mucosal barrier. So anything that irritates the mucosal lining. So it causes inflammation of the mucosal lining, and that can cause a whole series of different problems in your system. So gastritis, a generalized cause for inflammation. We have peptic or gastric ulcers. Now these ulcers is when you erode the wall of the stomach. So that means that simple columnar is destroyed, and you start to destroy things further below that as well. Now, a lot of this peptic ulcer, or this gastric ulcer as they're called, is caused by Helicobacter pylori, or H. pylori. Now, this bacteria is the typical cause, not the only cause, but it's the typical most common cause. And it causes the irritation of the stomach lining and destruction of that stomach lining, creating an opening or a hole, which is the ulcer. So it kind of looks like this. That opening you're seeing there, that opening is a gastric ulcer. Basically, it's an opening through the simple columnar. Now, in this picture, you can't tell how deep it goes. It might just be the submucosal, but it could also go deeper than that. If you're looking at the bacteria themselves, each one of these green things, and this is a false coloration, but each one of those green things is going to be the bacteria, simply sitting on the stomach lining, causing damage where it is. So some homeostatic imbalances, from gastritis to ulcers. But that's a little more about the physiology of how those gastric glands are working, and then a little about how the mucosal lining works as well.